Welcome back into our RPG course tutorials, and in this video is going to be quite a short video, and all we're going to do is define a cursor, a locked cursor. So as we can see now, we are just moving around our cursor, and if we click tab, that cursor lock becomes true, and now we can free look. So that is basically all we're going to do in this episode. And then after we implement this look, we are going to implement something that lets the character choose the direction that we are looking at. So if we look at this direction, the character goes in that direction. If we move in, say, this direction, the character goes that direction. So that is basically all we're going to do in this video. I know it sounds very simple, but believe me, it is not simple at all. So let's go and get out of the play mode and let's see what we need first. So this is our hierarchy, and this is what we got in here. So if you've been following my tutorials, all we have so far is a focus point. We have our camera outside of the player, and we don't have this empty game object right here. So in order to rotate the camera, we need two axes. We need a axis that will rotate the camera this way, which means the horizontal way, and a axis that will rotate the camera this way. So, we can look from up here. So I tried like a million times to have one focus point that moves in this direction and that also moves in this direction. But the problem is that if we move in this direction and then we move in this direction, the camera becomes in a unusual way. So if we place our camera inside the focus point, we are going to see what is happening. So this is what happens. We have a camera that is tilting in the wrong direction. So after trying for about an hour or something, I came up with a very simple solution. So the solution that I came up with is by parenting this object into an empty game object. So what I did is I created an empty game object, and then I put the focus point inside the game object. So now what we can do in here is we can manipulate with this focus point. So when we start the game, this focus point will be reset to 0. And also this game object can be rotation 0, but we can just move the transform. So I don't suggest moving the transform in this direction because that will give us errors. Instead, we can just move our focus point up here. So now if we parent this main camera into our focus point, as we can see in here, now we have a camera that is focused in here. So now we can just reset this and move this back a little bit. So now we can see our player. And the magic that happens in here is that we can move this object into only one axis, and then we can move the child object only in one axis. So if we do that, we can only change this axis, and now we can go into the top view, we can view it perfectly fine, and then to move it horizontal, we can move this direction, and this will never tilt. So this z-axis makes it tilt into other directions. So if we just keep clamping this back to 0 and only changing the y-axis, we will never end up with a tilted view. So that is basically the fundamental of this tutorial. Then we need one more function, and the function is to calculate the position of this focus point, which actually should be reset to 0, and also this reset to 0. And now we need to move this focus somewhere forward. So now if we have this focus point somewhere in here and our player is in here, when we move this game object, which we're gonna do right now, we're gonna see that this focus moved right here. So now there is a very simple way of calculating this angle and then just translating that angle into the input. And then from the input we can just rotate the whole entire player like this. And now the player is facing in that direction. Okay, so that's enough explanation. Now let's get down to coding. So into our script, this is the basic code that I have came up with. Okay, so what I've done in here is I've added a mouse look, which I will delete, and I'll delete the whole entire function. And then inside the movement, I have defined these two transforms in here, which I will delete as well. This I would suggest just ignoring. This is just for debugging. that I did earlier, so don't even look at this. Okay, so let's try and build that look at function. So to do that, let's just define a new method in here called mouse look, or you can call it whatever you want. So now we have a mouse look. Let's actually declare a void mouse look, and now we have a function mouse look. So what this mouse look has to do is to hold a boolean, and the boolean will only determine if we're actually using the mouse look or not. So to do that, I have already implemented a boolean up here, and I've called it cursor locked. So now if we accept a input, like saying input dot get key down, and the key code can be whatever you want. I'm just going to do tab for now. So if we press tab, we are going to check if this cursor has already been enabled. So to do that, we're just going to say cursor is equal to, if cursor is locked, which we can say just cursor, adding a question mark. So if cursor is locked, we want to unlock it. So we just want to set it to false. And if it isn't locked, we want to set it to true. So that is a very simple kind of switch function, which takes in only one line. Instead of just writing if cursor is equal to true, then cursor is equal to false. Okay, you get the idea. It's a little bit simpler. So then after checking this, we actually want to use it. So to use it, there's an even simpler way. We can just say if cursor, then return. So now if we don't have this enabled, the code that comes in here will not be executed. So that is exactly what we want. Okay, so now let's build the function that I just told you. So to do that, we are going to define a vector3 variable called relative vector. So as we can see, I even commented in here what it does. It is used to mouse look. So let's actually use it. And to use it, we are going to say relative vector is equal to transform dot inverse transform to point, and now in here we pass in a vector3 position. So for the position, I already told you we want to use that focus point. So focus point dot transform dot position. Now if you're wondering this focus point, where do we even get this? Well, I've just reserved a place in here. It's a very simple game object called focus point. I'm not even getting it. As you can see, I've commented it. And the way you just assign the focus point is just simply drag it and drop it into focus point. So after reading this relative vector, what do we want to do with it? So after doing that, we want this relative vector to be slash equal to relative vector dot magnitude. So that will basically give us a variable, and now we can just use this variable into a float variable. And the float variable, I've already defined it. I've defined it as a turn direction. By the way, turn direction is a private float. Now turn direction is equal to relative vector dot x, so we want to get only one direction, slash relative vector dot magnitude. So this will basically give us the angle from the transformed position, which means the actual player, to the focus point, which is our camera focus point. So now that we got a turn direction variable, let's use it. So before we get to use the turn direction, we want to actually enable the mouse look. So the mouse look works totally independently from this formula right here. So if you just want the mouse look, you don't have to include this formula in here. To use the mouse look, there's a very simple formula, and all you need to do is define a point that you want to rotate. So now first we want to rotate the vertical axis, and for the vertical axis we have a focus point dot transform dot Euler angles, and this is a vector3 variable. So instead of saying rotation, and rotation takes in a quaternion, we can just say Euler angles, and this will take in vector3s, which makes our life just a slight bit easier. So we want to do that, and we want to define it as a new vector3, and inside the vector3, obviously it takes in 3 parameters. We want to say in here focus point dot transform dot position, dot transform dot Euler angles dot x, and then all we want to do with this x is add to this rotation. So the variable that we want to add, you might have guessed what we're going to add. We're going to say plus input dot get axes, and the axis name is called mouse y. So make sure to spell this correctly. So the M in here is capital and the Y is capital, and there is a space in here. And as I said a moment ago, we want these other axes to be 0. So we just pass in 0. And now for the horizontal is kind of similar. So let's name this horizontal. And for the horizontal is just a very slight bit different. So for the horizontal, we don't want to move the focus point, but instead we want to say focus point dot transform dot parent. So we want to mess with the parent object of the focus point. So parent dot rotate. So since we only have to rotate one angle, we can just say rotate transform dot up, and you might have guessed it, what we are going to multiply it with. We're going to multiply it with input dot get axes. The axis is mouse x. Make sure to spell it correctly, obviously. And now here is where you decide if you want your game to be a little bit more bug resistant, if you may call it so. So you can pass in here a time.delta time, and now this function will run in the same power, should I say, in any frame rate. If you don't pass this time.delta time, this function will only run if the game has vsync turned off. So obviously I want to make sure that my game runs decently fine. So I want to pass in time.delta time, and after you pass in time.delta time, this function will slow down, obviously, because there's less frames. And to speed it up, we're just going to pass in 100. So there is our focus point taken care of, and now let's just do a very quick test. So instead of going into our component and looking if this cursor locked is true or not, what we can do is create a onGUI function. This is the syntax for it. You define a new rectangle position, and then you pass in your string. So I've already defined a cursor locked with the cursor locked boolean. Hit save, go back to your game, and now we can test it. So the hierarchy stays the same. We have a game object, we have the focus point inside the game object. Make sure that the focus point is just slightly ahead of your player. Also make sure that your rotation is set to 0, so you don't want errors to be appearing in your game. So now we have almost everything set up. So if we hit play, we should see our mouse working. Okay, so now we have this cursor locked false. So if I press tab, cursor becomes true, and now I have mouse movement. So as we can see, I can move up and down, left and right. Okay, so now I have a very slight problem that our rotations work perfectly fine in the y-axis, but in the horizontal axis, they work kind of differently. Now let's see why that is happening. As we can see, our parent game object is rotating perfectly fine, as we can see in the rotations in here. So if we rotate it, only one axis is rotating. But if we take a look at our focus point, we're going to see that the rotations are varying. So if we rotate it, we're going to see rotations not working very fine. So let's go ahead and fix that. Okay, let's see what we have in here. We have a focus point which moves in the vertical axis. We have our focus point transform, and we have this y-axis set to 0. So in order to fix our slight problem, what we're going to have to do is pass in a new variable in the y-axis. So the variable that we are going to pass in is the exact same variable that it already has. So just copy focus.transform.Euler angles and pass it in the y-axis. And we can't just leave it like that, because that's a vector3. We need a float in here, as we can see in here. So in order to do that, we're just going to tell it focus transform Euler angles dot y. So now let's save our script. Let's go back into Unity and let's see if it worked. So let's hit play and let's see what we have. So we have everything working perfectly fine, and now we can see our mouse movement is working perfectly fine. So we can move in the horizontal axis, we can also move in the vertical axis. So that is pretty good. Okay, now what we're gonna do is define the function that lets the player walking into the direction that we're looking at. Okay, so here is the script so far. We already defined that function that lets us know if we're looking that way or not. And now all we're going to do is copy this turn direction, go into our on GUI and paste it in here. Now the reason for that is because of debugging purposes, of course. And now let's pass in here turn direction, and for the variable we're going to obviously pass in the turn direction. I am also going to make sure that this turn direction does not give me a number that has 10 digits after 0. I'm just going to pass it toString and then 0.00. So now I'm going to save that and go back into my Unity, and now we should see a brand new variable popping up here. So if we've done everything correctly, we should see a 0, and now if we move our mouse, we should see a negative, and if we move into the right direction, we should see a positive value. So that is a perfectly good indicator that our function is working. So now all we need to do is tell this character to move into that direction. So to do that, what I'm going to do is go into my movement. I've already defined a function that lets me know if I am pressing the vertical key. So only after I'm pressing the vertical key, I'm going to make my character rotate into a certain direction. So the way that I have achieved that is by using a transform.rotate function. So that's as simple as saying transform.rotate. So the problem is that what variable we are going to pass inside here. So as we can see, it takes in a Euler and it has some overloads. Now we don't really want to worry about the overloads, we just want to worry about the vector 3. So what do we want to pass in here? Well, we have a very handy trick that we can use, and that is called transform.up. Now transform.up refers to the y-axis. And what do we want to do with the y-axis? Well, we obviously want to multiply it with some value. So the value that we want to multiply in here is that turn amount value that we calculated in here. So let's pass in turn direction, and also let's pass in a way of multiplying that turn direction. Because as we saw a moment ago, this turn direction is a very small value. So just define in a public float turn multiplier. Okay, so just copy that turn multiplier, paste it down here, and then we want our golden value in here, which is time.delta time. So if you're new to Unity, this time.delta time will save your life. So now we have a function that will rotate the player. So let's see if it works. Save it, go back to Unity, and there we have it. We have a new float in here that is turn multiplier. So let's put this turn multiplier up to 100 and let's see if it actually works. So let's turn on the cursor. So now I'm facing this direction, and as we can see, our player is turning. Now that is brilliant, because if we turn this direction, the player turns that direction. And we can see that if we focus up into our player in here, let's try that again. If we look this way, he turns this way. If you look this way, he turns that way. So that is massive success. All we want to do now is tell the camera to move into the opposite direction. And to do that, it is not very hard. So go back into your script, and where we have our transform rotate, we're going to define a brand new transform rotate. So now that we have rotated the character, what do we want to do? We want to rotate the camera into the opposite direction. So in here we're going to say focus point dot transform dot parent, because the parent moves into the horizontal direction, dot rotate. You can just straight up copy this function and paste it in here, and the only modification that we are going to make in here, you might have guessed it what we're going to do. We're going to turn it in the opposite direction, and we are simply going to put in a minus in here. So now everything is working perfectly fine. Don't forget your semicolon, hit save, and go back into your game. So now if we've done everything correctly, this should work flawlessly. So let's turn our cursor. Now we're looking in the all directions. Now we want to walk in that direction. So if I hit forward, we should see our player turning in that direction, and he keeps on walking. So now obviously we can turn in any direction we want. And now we just build GTA into Unity. So this took me a little bit to do. Actually, it took me all day to do. I'm just lying to you. And if you've done this if you've done this during this episode, well, congratulations to you. You can just bump this turn multiplier to 500, so he takes in smaller circles, and there it is. So one last thing that you can do is go back into your script, and then what you can do in here is lock the cursor into the middle of your screen. And to do that, you can do it in one line. You can say cursor dot lock state is equal to cursor locked. Then we want to lock it, so cursor lock state dot locked. Otherwise we want to unlock it, so cursor lock mode dot none. So this will lock your cursor into the middle of your screen, and also you cannot see the cursor. So now if I go ahead and hit play, everything is working fine. If I press in tab, we should see our cursor just disappear. So now we can just walk into our screen. Okay, so that is what I have prepared for this video. I hope you found it interesting. I hope you liked the video, and we will see in the next video. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.